Hello and
Hello.
welcome, welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage. This is a series of conversations between myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and my good chum, Mike Hutchinson, a games designer and developer. It's a series of conversations so splendid that a full 2,000 people or more have chosen to subscribe to this channel. And as a thank you and a celebration of that, we've been running through some questions asked by our Discord. We've been running through these questions for at least the last two videos, but I think this will be the last one, one way or another. And so we're going to launch straight into it. These are various questions asked by various members of Discord. Now, this one, funnily enough, was sort of a second part to the conversation that we, or at least was asked as a second part to the question we answered in the last conversation. But it's
If
fine.
you haven't watched the last conversation, you can go back and watch it on this feed.
I think they keep them available for some odd reason.
Mm.
Um, so this question is about your personal painting, kit bashing, etc. Sort of position philosophy. How has your hobby or your painting style changed
Ah.
since you began gaming as an adult? And do you have a pile of shame? So I do. That's my pile of shame. That's my unpainted miniature. That's a Man of War Slaneshi flagship.
Did you
that's the
recently
only
acquire
mini.
that, or is that one that's been sitting around since we last played Man of
That's
War?
probably been sitting around since we've last played. That's been sitting there for a little while. I proxied a fair few bits, and I thought, no, I'm gonna treat myself, and got that guy. And that's the only mini I have that I intend to paint and have not yet painted. So that's my in relation to painting style and how your painting style has advanced since the
Didn't say
start.
advanced
Yeah,
necessarily.
my painting style has not advanced one whit since I started. since I went back to gaming as an adult. I don't I don't Zenithal Prime, and I'm not really sure about contrast paint. My painting is very old school. It's a base coat and a highlight and a wash, and then a highlight and another highlight, and then that's that. And I prime
It's
black or
good enough
white.
for Mike McVeigh.
I mean, it's fine. I'm fine with like tabletop quality miniatures. They look just dandy. I don't, that's very much one where I don't necessarily have the patience to keep up with the new trends and things.
Mm.
Um, in relation to kit bashing, Mike might let you know, I kit bash almost obsessively. It's very rare that I get a mini out and put it together as the sculptor or the kit designer intended. Almost everything gets clippers taken to it and some mucking about and whatnot. I think in all honesty, I find the kit bashing part of putting miniatures together more sort of expressive. And I think it's why I liked Warhammer Fantasy Battle, back in the day so much, because you could get an overall effect of like, well, here's a whole story in a way that I find harder to do with a single miniature.
Mm.
And I think if you're going to do that with a single miniature, it maybe asks more of your painting. Whereas what I want to do is like put down a band or a group of people that I've mucked about with physically and reshaped them to tell a story rather than like painted them in a particular way. So yeah, I kit bash a lot. My painting is very, very old school, fast and basic. And I have a pile of shame, but it's not excessive. What about you, Mike?
Excessive piles of shame, eh? So my pile of opportunity is so large, it's a shed of opportunity. So yeah, I habitually acquire and assemble and game with miniatures that I then never really get round to painting, or I start painting but I don't complete. That's changed a bit in the last couple of years, where I've found a bit more of a mojo for actually finishing things, but it tends to be around Like when we gather together at my house, that will always motivate me to finish a force or something. But yeah, no, my my pile of opportunities is ludicrous, and it's sort of, I think about it more like a sort of person who has a wine cellar thinks about it. Like they lay down some miniatures because because they had the availability to buy them at the time, and they're not really losing their value in any meaningful way. And I don't really like storing a ton of like GW plastic kits, although they do hold their value fairly well. They don't sort of increase in the same way that like the right kind of, like when Specialist Games basically went under, I had a credit card and I went and spent like 500 quid on like old Necromunda and Blood Bowl metal miniatures, and definitely made all that money back, you know, and some War Master bits and bobs on eBay over the years, because I like that sort of sensation of laying things down. Like I have a metal Chaos Dwarf army that still isn't painted, and every so often a miniature from that army gets painted, but it's not like it should be, you know, the beloved army that I have carefully painted over many years. But it's not. It's just a thing that I get out occasionally. You just go, look at these guys, they're still worth loads of money, and I still enjoy them, and it doesn't matter. um and so the other half of this question is that I was thinking about my whole collection. I proxy loads, but I actually don't kit bash that much, and that's something that's changed a lot from when I was a kid. Like most of the miniatures that I've got in my little case of miniatures that I kept, many of them are like very, very poorly assembled, like hack and slash kind of kit bash things. But actually, since getting back into the hobby, I just love the work that so many artists are doing, that I just like, I'll get a miniature and I'm like, well, I could mess with this, but it's really good and I just want to enjoy it the way that it's been made. Because like other people might, that there's a school of like, well, kit bashing because I don't want mine to be stock. Your kit bashing, I think, is slightly different, which is I'm trying to tell like an overall aesthetic story. But like quite a lot of people, and I sense this from myself, it's like, well, I want to convert this because I don't want it to be stock, but like I want to enjoy this miniature, and I can enjoy this miniature in its pure form without having to like feel bad that it's the same as everyone else's miniatures, because this is my one and I get to enjoy it. And particularly, I think that with like the metal Malifaux miniatures and like the weird sort of pulp figures from Bob, what's his name, Bob
Merch.
Merch. Like they're just great, just great little objects, and I like enjoying them the way that they were intended. Although I will say it is a very, very common sight to see a head swap in my collection, because I find that like if you take something like a Space Marine or a Sigmarine and you put an old man's head or a woman's head on it, they just look really good, and they just go like, oh, there's something different going on there. And so I do that. I do head swaps quite a lot.
I think one of the things that makes me saddest about the fact that the GW seems to have gone like monopose for its plastic kits is that
Some of them, yeah.
when you got like a plastic kit out and it was all just a pile of heads and arms and torsos and legs, there wasn't a drive to like kit bash it to not be standard, because everyone, they're all put together in different configurations and in different poses and things, and the things never felt particularly like, and kit bashing was just like, we'll pour out two different boxes at once and then sort of glue them together.
Yeah, and I've got that fun coming up with this box of Cromlech orcs that they sent
Mm.
me, and they are predominantly, they are like second edition GW kind of schema, in that they are like legs and torso stick together, different arms stick together, holding different weapons stick together, and there's loads of opportunity to sort of, just assembling them as God intended naturally results in tons of like organic variation.
So next question is predictions for how minis wargaming might change over the next few years, and are there any changes you'd like to see realized? So I think, again, this is sort of harkening back to some things we've said about like the changes and the trends we tend to be seeing. Um, I mean, one of the obvious things is like, the rise in 3D printing, and the availability of high quality STL files for doing that. And it has to be said, the rise in absolute crap STL files for doing it as well, both of which are sort of alongside each other, as is inevitable in these things.
Mm.
But I think like the availability of like print farms and um print farms that can like um hub create on like genuinely worthwhile scales, I think is something
And
that,
you're talking about there from like a small creator's perspective, right?
well, a small creator and I think potentially up to a sort of mid-sized creator, I think we're not a million miles away from a point where like even spin casting is probably, but we're like mass producing in one place and shipping a mini to another country, even for a producer the size of like Weird, might be like soon to be a thing of the past.
Mm-hmm.
I think we might be coming to a point where in the next sort of few years it's going to be a case of like all minis are going to be some form of, if not produce on demand, in like in relatively local hubs and shipped relatively short distances.
Yes,
And
and for a particular portion of the industry, you end up with a customer experience that like nothing's ever out of stock, and you can get anything from my back catalog. And
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that sort of it's
I think
becoming.
your problem with that model is where the retailers fit in. Like maybe they're just ordering from those hubs, but it's a longer tail feeling distribution model that doesn't quite mesh with like current and historical retail model.
I mean, I look. I mean, I think that certain historical retail models have been in trouble for a little while now, and I think that where the ones that survive and do well are ones that offer something besides like a physical product. And I think for a hobby which involves painting and playing, and using miniatures, the the fact that the fact that you can get the physical miniature more easily through the post shouldn't necessarily be a huge problem for people who are offering knowledge and community to use those minis, because it's like anytime I've ever had a friendly local gaming store, it hasn't been about the convenience of obtaining the physical object from it by any stretch of the imagination, and that wasn't true before the internet, frankly.
Yeah,
uh,
maybe. I mean, I guess, yeah, we aren't retailers, and certainly we're not in North America. And I think,
no, absolutely, but yeah, so I mean, I think that that's a thing that's coming up, and I think it's a thing that is good for independent games designers. It may or may not be good for independent gaming stores, but that's kind of their problem.
so to tack onto this, like this might be wish listing, but like what I perceive right now is that there's an enormous number of independent or medium size STL creators, and there's an enormous number of game creators, whether that's tabletop games or RPGs or mini games, and there's just nowhere for those two things to come together sensibly in the mind of the consumer.
Hmm.
So like some I think have started to lead the way here. So I like the way that, for example, Bestarium offers not just Dungeons and Dragons and Morkborg rules, but also Forbidden Psalm sort of rules. So they connect their essentially generically usable miniatures with a specific way of using it. But I think that there's a way that it could go so much further. And I talked a bit about like there's no Steam for miniature games right now, but like I have a dream that I can't be bothered to figure out how to build and start a company to do, because that's not what I want to do. I want to be on this platform. I don't want to build this platform. But like I would like to look at a Bestaria miniature on, my Mini Factory version 2 and discover what games other people think are good for this miniature, or what this miniature could represent in these games, so that I've got some interconnectivity between the object that I want to print paint and the way that I can actually use it in a game, rather than it just being completely separate and me have as a consumer have to do all the work to connect these things and wire these things together. And I just think it's such a massive opportunity because there's so much creativity, but there's so much appetite and cleverness in the player base that they're all connecting these things together, but you just have to like peel it out of like Reddit threads, and there's just no way of aggregating all of this cleverness.
Yeah, no, it's insane to me. My mini factory, like as a platform, particularly, hasn't just gone. You know, this should be more sort of filter searchable and sort of more engineered to allow people to go, I'm playing this game, what do people who play this game tend to search for on my mini factory, because it's like that site could, it has a lot of people swinging by it. It could be so much more usable. And it's like when I do the roundup for Kickstarter, I'm always trying to say, well, this is what these minis could be used for. This is the sort of game, because like Kickstarter campaigns for STLs don't bother. Often it feels like don't bother trying to think about what you might be then using those STLs for. They're just like, I made these
Well,
guys.
and partly it's kind of not it's not their specialism, it's not their place necessarily. Like if your love is making is it's like almost video game concept art developing into 3D models, like
Hmm.
yeah, you've got a world and you've got a vision of like what it is that you want to create, but like understanding this, these whole 6 shelves of miniature games and role-playing games that I've got over here, and being clever enough to slot those in, like there are people out there, and that's what like communities are for. It's just that there's no way for that to bubble up. So I don't feel cross that they aren't doing it. I feel sad that there's no way for that to just be done on their behalf and it be in one place that I'm always expecting to go and learn about.
Hmm. So next question is, will war games fully transition away from traditional physical models to something like tabletop simulator or whatever?
No,
No, no.
no.
I mean,
Next question.
this thing. Frankly, they could have years ago. If people wanted them to, they could have quite a while. It's
Yeah, I
not.
mean, look, we're still playing miniature games and we've all been playing video games our entire life. We
Yeah,
still read books even though the Kindle has existed for 20 years or whatever it is right now. Like it,
yeah.
it's
People.
a perfectly sensible form factor for enjoying things, particularly with other humans in the same room as them. I
I
can't
just.
enjoy I can't enjoy a tabletop simulator game with someone in the same room. I mean, I'm an edge case because I frankly can't enjoy tabletop simulator at all anymore.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's just that because it's not like playing tabletop simulator is for me utterly unrelated to the hobby that I do. Like, yes, I could theoretically execute the same games within that environment. It's just got nothing to do with the hobby that I do.
Well, it's just generally, it's like so many minis games you could play without the minis anyway.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? With or without tabletop simulator, and yet we persist in spending hundreds of pounds and
on
multiple
what could just
hours,
be MDF circles.
yeah, on the minis that like a solid 90% of minis games do not need. You physically don't need these things. So
The deadly secret of this channel.
well, I mean, look,
It's only better. Who gives a fuck about the miniatures games?
my persistent thing is making the actual physical miniatures matter and caring about doing that, and it
Turns out
perpetually.
to actually be a thing that is quite hard.
It perpetually annoys me the number of games you could just play with like little D batteries for all the value of the cylinder that they are. And yet we still put like obscene amounts of effort and money into like putting out nice sets of minis because people just like minis. We don't People don't play physical minis games because it's the most efficient way of achieving the mechanics of of the rule sets we write. People do it because it's fun, it's fun and they like it. Um, the biggest surprise when implementing mechanic in a game. Are there any mechanics that look great on paper but were a disaster when you physically, got them onto tabletop or use them in the game? Have you? Okay, if Mike's got one. Go.
In A Billion Suns, you should definitely get money back for ships that don't get destroyed. Obvious, 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 obvious.
Yeah, it's a terrible idea. It's such a bad idea.
Such a bad mechanic.
So bad. It's
Like,
like,
like almost like almost like spiritually blasphemous in its badness. Like it's like it was like it just like taunted all that was good in the world to once we put that rule in. So
I
no,
mean,
this makes this game so deeply unpleasant.
yeah. I mean, frankly, A Billion Suns was a collection
An
of,
object lesson in attempting to answer this question for a later podcast.
yeah, was a series of mechanics that looked like they should be fine on paper and were like being pushed for a mangle to physically play. There were points in playtesting that where I just looked around at the other playtesters and said, I'm really sorry, so sorry I had to put you through that. That was horrible, and the things that made it horrible were so innocuous and so
Mm.
like, this is the route one of doing this. That thing needed a whole language of its own to make work. I know. I mean, for my, I'm both very stubborn and very sort of iterative in my process. So it's very rare that I come up with an idea that I don't like ruthlessly batter into a shape that can be used.
Yeah.
So nothing sort of jumps out at me in respect to that sort of thing. I think like a lot of the time it's like scenarios. It happens a shit ton in scenarios where you
Yeah.
suddenly realize you've encouraged completely the wrong sort of behavior. And that I've been so many scenarios just like, well, that it's here's an objective in the middle of the table, go to the objective, stand on the objective and score some points. This is so like, obviously it's like, no, that isn't going to work for this game. That isn't the way that this game runs. Victory conditions, end game conditions, those are the sorts of things that I find quite often go like badly awry, and you suddenly discover you've got a game that just never ends or ends at the wrong time. um Core mechanics, generally no. Generally I sort of I try to find a way to get those things to work, but yes, not just, yeah, the things that I think, the things that are meant to manipulate player behavior, like scenarios, those are the things that most often go fully off kilter. um how tabletop games relate to and borrow from PC games and vice versa.
Hmm.
um I mean, I think generally across all sorts of games, I've said this before, mechanics are the medium with which games get created. They are not the form or the art that is created. And they fully pass back and forth. It's you know it's like a painter seeing a particular shade of, I know, green in a movie, and then they're going to go and use that green in a painting. It's that level of sort of like, these are the basic materials out of which I make things, and if I see them happen, in a video game, um, then I'm going to like figure out how to translate it like physically and component wise. And sometimes the process of figuring out how to translate it from one like um presentation system to another is like, brings up its own things and its own problems and its own bits of interest, because it's like, there are some things you just can't, obviously there are some things you can't do on the tabletop you can do in a video game. Figuring out how to like cardboardize a digital game like brings up its own like bits of fun. And tabletop games, I think, do different things. I'm not sure if like they're fully a different art form, but they're much less about a storytelling, like a direct sort of I'm telling a story to you storytelling approach. And they're much more, you know, about something emergent and something interactive and performative.
Yeah, and obviously there's an intensity and a responsiveness and a sort of immersion is not quite the word I want to use, but like there's a directness about video games that you simply can't translate across, and so you have to engage other parts of the brain. Um,
I mean that I mean just to like, because that's one of the weird things, like narrative tabletop games struggle with immersion, like abstract tabletop games where what is happening is you are playing a game of like drafts, immensely immersive. It feels exactly like I'm playing a game of drafts. It's like,
well, that's why,
like
yeah, I didn't really want to say, but like, so for example, I'm working on this Doom inspired game at the moment. And Doom is a very visceral, fast-paced, direct, like, as an experience it does what video games can do. Sports can do it as well. Like, and to a degree, blockbuster action movies can do it as well. It's like, I'm right there, there's stuff and things happening. This obviously has the additional layer of decision making layered on it. And so as I'm thinking about how to make that work on the tabletop, I can't do the things that are so visceral and fizzy, but I can take that puzzle and that interest and that thought process and find another way to express it, which is a different pace, it's a different speed, it's a different rhythm, but it can share some of those same sort of sensations. I think for me, like, the answer to this question kind of splits into two, which is, on the one hand, in terms of the relationships between miniature games and um, video games. Like, I play a lot of video games simply to carry the experience of them away, and then have that in my heart as I'm sitting down to push little toy cars around, or pew pew aliens, so that I've got something else to sort of. I've got an emotional experience in myself that can then connect with as a designer, rather than sort of, it's why I do the same thing with movies as well. Like, just coming at it from a sort of theoretical point of view, it's like, well, I want something exciting with explosions and aliens. Let me see if I can calculate the answer to that. Versus having just watched Aliens and played, an Alien video game and stuff, and I'm like, okay, what's this going to feel like? And I want to, get some of that stuff out. So I think that's in one half of it, and the other half for me is, I had this lovely opportunity to go to Canterbury Christchurch University and talk to their lovely game design students. And most of them, I think this is probably true to say, that most of them are hoping for a career in video games, but they are all on some level and at some part of their course working on tabletop games, because there's a lot that you can, the education system has decided there's a lot that you can learn from those two disciplines when you plug them together. And the other thing is that the presentation that I was giving, which you can find on Planet Smasher Games YouTube channel, is about playtesting games, and is an enormous amount of, like, practical shared skills that you can bring from one discipline to another. So even aside from, like, the pure sort of mechanical and game design inspiration pieces, there's also, like, sort of the secondary layer of skills which are super translatable, about, like, how rigorous are you about considering your design goals and principles and stuff and your design document up front. Like, how well do you understand the psychology of humans as you think about your mechanics? How well are you able to sort of interpret the bizarre noisy signals that humans give you when they play your game? How do you think about the productizing and the getting it out into market? All that stuff is, they really don't feel like different beasts at that point.
yeah, I mean it's interesting. Like, we recently had a conversation about deck building mechanics,
Hmm.
and like deck building is a really interesting mechanic, I think, in relation to like digital games back and forth, because like I was talking to somebody I was sort of working on designing a game for, and I was like, oh, I think a deck builder would be a good idea, and they didn't know anything about tabletop games, and I've played some deck builder games, like Slay the Spire and that. You mean deck building like that? And I have to say, well, no, not really. No, the deck building that's in digital games is mechanically, weirdly, very different from the deck building that's in tabletop games. You know, because they've reinterpreted it for, like, digital gaming, but they've done some things that can now come back to the tabletop, and you can take those mechanics and you could retranslate them back to the tabletop quite happily because they're sort of so closely related. And it's like, we've talked a few times on the channel about a video game Superliminal, and I was sort of playing that game. And it's a game about like arranging objects and then lining up a viewpoint and then looking like a certain thing and then becoming that certain thing. And playing that game, I was just like, this is about like putting things down at different perspectives and then looking from a particular position to see what they look like. And if they look like, it's like, why is that? That's basically all, like all tabletop miniatures games are about, like trying to line things up from a weird perspective and then getting the perspective of them, and if they look the way that you thought they did, you get points. And it's like,
Yeah, if only we could manage the sorcery.
well, yeah, I mean, I think there's something there. It's like I
No,
just picked
definitely.
up
Yeah.
Redwood, which is a game we have to get together and play, and that's a game about carefully maneuvering around and taking photographs of things, and it's like it just genuinely should be like you're talking about immersion, moving around very slowly and carefully until things are arranged into a certain diorama and then taking a photograph of it really ought to be a tabletop miniatures game, oughtn't it? It feels like that's yeah. So I think there's like a lot of cross pollination and whatnot. Favorite games or game designers and things they've done especially well. So we talked before about like we're not going to go super deep into like particularly brilliant game designers. I think at the moment we might do like a series of conversations on that. But some of my favorite games I think do like really interesting things that popped in my mind when I heard this question. Mysterium, which is like of recent times the game that like has come out most often at like family gatherings and things like that around my family.
Mm.
And it's like it should come as no great surprise because it's a game about communication control and weird sort of built up languages between groups of people. Magic Maze is a game where I played it, and after I played it, I had a real moment of, ah, shit, I really wish I'd come up with that. I abs They such a clever sort of central mechanic, and it's unbelievably satisfying when it goes well. It's one of those moments that's just like, this is sort of an alien like way of thinking, and it's like you've become so empathically linked to the person you're playing with. And it's such a dumb, fast, silly party game. At the same time, I think it's an absolute like magical bit of game design. And I've talked about it recently a few times on the channel. One of my current personal favorite games is Mega City Oceana, just because the way that it jams together two completely incongruent sets of mechanics, that it's like a full-on Euro game with the dumbest sort of dexterity balancing game mashed into each other. And for me, it just works absolutely perfectly. It's exactly right that it turns this sort of quite dry Euro engine into something very performative and very sort of tense, and you have these great moments where these things fall over. Those are some games that I think are just really do some smart small things that I'm deeply jealous of and would rip off if I only had the means and the skill to do so. Is there any that jump out for you as like favorite games, or games that you think do something particularly spectacular?
Yeah, as you've been talking, I've been trying to rack my brain for something I've played this year that's sort of blown me away. I think that the reality is that I've been playing a lot of games to learn about them, or because they're in areas that are similar to an area that I'm working in and I want to know about them. And what that's ended up being is that I've actually played quite a lot of mediocre games in the last 5 months. But I guess one of note that I'm not even sure is particularly good, but it just really shocked me when we started playing it, is I have a 7-year-old daughter, so I bought Lorcana, a couple of boxes of Lorcana, and the designer of that has basically taken my core problems with Magic the Gathering and sort of flipped them around so that they're no longer problems. And I haven't played enough of the game because we're basically just playing with the first two decks, and we're just mechanically stepping through this, and I'm not really attacking or doing anything yet, so I don't really know if the game works. Like, it just does a few, just does this a few things that just were like, yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like you get cards in your hand, and they're the ones that you get to play out as land, and it's like Race to the Galaxy. Every card in your hand is potentially sacrificed to pay for other cards, and so there's a juicy decision with every card. Except there could be a problem there, and so there's a tiny mechanic where some of the cards you can't play out, as you know, some 30% of the cards can't be played in that way. Um, there's another small thing, and sorry, this is just like minor, like if you're frustrated with if you're not frustrated with Magic the Gathering, then none of these things really will be of interest. But like, there's just this beautiful change where you gain points not by attacking the other player, but by questing. And it's just a non-violent reinterpretation of that, where I just get to, if I've got free resources and they've got the right icons on, I can spend those resources and I can get some points, and so I can accelerate towards victory. And it's 20 points to win. It just happens to be 20 points of me rather than 20 points taken from you. It's
I mean, it's interesting when you reframe a zero sum gain thing into it's. There's no reason for this zero sum gain thing to be about me hurting you, because it's exactly the same thing if it's about me gaining stuff,
right.
because
And
it's
here
literally zero sum.
one game is about, you know, the mystical energies of animation and creation, creating its own life and storming off to great things, and the other is about me zapping you with fireballs, and both of those are fine and great, and they have a different texture, and that's why they have a different mechanic.
I mean, it's interesting. Keyforge, isn't it? Is about like gaining stuff as much as it is about attacking
Oh,
people. You've got
right.
to make these. I think you're making keys. I think I've played it like twice, and it's like you've got to gather up amber or something to make keys. I'm sure somebody's shouting at the screen at this point.
Well,
Um,
and then the third thing about Lorcana is that you tap your dudes to go and get the victory points, but if you tap the dudes, then they're allowed to be attacked by the other guy. So on your turn, you can only attack tapped dudes on the other side of the table, which is just an inverse of the way that Magic works, which is, you know, I tap my guys to send them off, and you, if you haven't got anything tapped, gets to choose and which ones to block. And what I love about that is partly that what I love about that is that it means that I can just crack on with my turn doing things, and it's not like I've got to hold things back in quite the same way, even though ultimately there's still a decision about whether things will be risked or not. I just yeah, so I just anyway, so that's, I'm not sure if it's the best game in the world, but I just loved what a sort of mechanical love letter to Magic the Gathering it is, but quite a thoughtful one.
okay. Favorite miniatures company is the question that's popped up. So I was thinking about this, and it's like, well, the companies that I go to first when I am searching for something, for a project, whatever, are going to be Crooked Dice. I say Bob Murch's range of pulp figures. Baz Squiddo is a little independent that's worth giving a shout out to, because they often have like interesting stuff. And they're the three that will be like the first in my search engine when I am looking for the sort of slightly weird things that minis I'm looking for like some sort of specific narrative story. I realize like a lot of the time now, obviously I've got a 3D printer. It's the various sort of non-specific and independents that populate my mini factory, but there are lots of really great designers on there that you can pick stuff up from. But yeah, I think those are the three miniatures companies specifically that I always go to first when I'm searching. Do you have a favorite miniatures company?
No, my favorite miniatures company is the one that I just discovered that I didn't know about before, because that's what I love, is discovering new miniature ranges. So things that I think are lovely, like there's a range called the Northumbrian Tin Soldier that just melts my heart with how gorgeous they are and how cute they are. I have been recently painting some relic blade miniatures, and they're just so like gloriously, they're like the Bob Merch ones in that they're like, the shapes are really clear and they're built for painting, and so that I think is really wonderful. And what's the other things that I've been painting? The other things I've tremendously enjoyed painting recently are uh, literal 80s rogue trader space orcs. They have some of the best faces ever committed to
Which
mildly toxic metal.
what company would
I
have
think that
made them?
was yeah, Marauder or something they're called.
Yeah, some little, nobody concerned that didn't go anywhere.
But
Um,
yeah, but I also enjoy painting 3D things, 3D printed things that Glenn's forges produce.
so the next question is, and it's one I genuinely don't even sort of know how to answer, and it's most underrated minis game designer, and I genuinely don't know how to answer it because it is like, obviously we're recently writing a book where I went through referencing a whole bunch of minis games for doing proper referencing in the book, like Grown Ups, and it's like, Malifaux has, 5 designers listed on it, that, I would imagine like even quite firm fans of that game I'm going to be able to name the fourth name on that list. You know, X-wing. The number of X-wing players who could name, the designer of that is probably fairly minimal, and so it's like, well, are those guys massively underrated? Well, we can. I couldn't before I wrote that. I can now, but I couldn't before I wrote
Oh,
that.
yeah, I listened to a great podcast with him from Third Floor Gaming a few years ago, where he talks about both X-Wing and the Star Wars role-playing game. It's like two very different
Yeah,
games,
no,
but
I mean,
both incredibly influential.
yeah, and it's like that's that's obviously a great design, and it's like, are those the most underrated guys? Is it like, um you go on wargames vault, and you could look up, and there is enough free games on wargames vault, you could literally read an entire game a day for the next couple of years and not run out of new games. Are
Mhm.
those guys the most underrated designers because they literally nobody is rating them? Is it like Mark Halliwell because he's not the one that gets brought up in most conversations of like golden age GW designs, even though he designed some of the best games of the golden age GW period? It's like, I genuinely do not know how I would rate underratedness in miniatures games designers because they're all so underrated, so much of the time. So I genuinely looked at that question. It's like, I honestly don't know how I would even go about starting to answer that. But do you have a solid, a better opinion on that one?
No, like the uncredited guy that wrote Warhammer 40,000 Apocalypse, like the only good version of Warhammer 40,000 that exists, but I
Well,
don't know who wrote it.
I don't exactly. It's like, aside from the good things, it's like the most played miniatures game, in the world at the moment is uncredited. You know what I mean?
Yes,
I don't know.
yeah, although the design team in that instance have had much more of the rules design team have had a bit more oxygen on social media and stuff than
Yeah,
the
but
previous
just
generation.
but just generally, it's like, the biggest games in the hobby at the moment are presumably written by very underrated people because the majority of people don't know who the hell they are. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's one where it's like, I genuinely do not know how I would sort of pass down that question. So the next question is top 5 things learned from the Discord. And I was planning on writing down 5 things, but I didn't get around to it.
No,
I mean,
that question's too much admin.
wait too much. I mean, I mean, mostly, we decided to start the Discord, a little while ago now. Myself, and Monk was one of our subscribers who was very firm on the idea that I should start a Discord, and he gets a lot of credit for that, I think. And it's, I don't know if I can pick out 5 specific things, but the thing that I've learned from the Discord is that there is, a smart, committed, interested, creative community of, independent is sort of over crediting the amount of recognition and return they get for the work they put into the games, of people out there who are doing incredibly inventive things. It's like, I talk about, war games vault, and it is like, there are swathes of people doing incredible design work, thinking in really original and interesting ways about these old school design problems. And it's something that is so easily accessible these days, and we can all get together and we can throw an idea up and have really smart people say incredibly insightful things about it, and it's delightful and makes me feel very happy. That's a short answer of what I've learned from our Discord.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And the community is absolutely humming at the moment, to the point where, like, if there's a design question on the table, there's always 3 or 4 of these smart people around to chew on it with, and it's never the same people, and so you get a real mixture of kind of experiences and sort of assumptions brought to the table, which is really fantastic.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's such a self-propelling community at this point. It's like there's a world where
It's almost too noisy.
I mean, what yeah, it's interesting because it's like depending on you can just ignore a certain channel and to let like the messages get to a certain point and skip through it. But there's always another channel you can go into and have a quiet conversation. I mean, I know it's my Discord, but it's like my favorite Discord at the moment. Discord server at the moment. What do old miniatures games still have to offer? And this is one
Oh,
where
so much.
yeah, we mentioned before, like the Donald Featherstones and the Tony Baths and people like that, and it's like every time I read one of Donald Featherstone's, or any of the guys from that era sort of books or ideas, it's just absolutely takes the knees out from under me as to how inventive and smart and just like modern so much the stuff they were doing was. I said like there's one of the naval war games which suggests getting your ships and mounting them on broom handles and then having like 2 tables, and so you can use your ships to like ferry people from one table to another, and then you can use stools to be like reefs, because then and it's the dumbest thing in the world, but it's like, oh Jesus, that's so cool. I wish we'd done something like that for A Billion Suns, because it's like
Yeah.
right there the thing of like having multiple tables and having the space between the tables be a play space for a certain sort of game. It's like that's so like creative and avant-garde in its sort of brilliance. And I was reading one in his solo wargamings recently about like getting different people to draw a map of the battlefield and then giving them to the various commanders to represent the imperfect information that your commander has about the battlefield. And so you plan out your deployment on that map, and then you put your minis down, and if they don't match the reality of the situation, and it's like, well, that's just a beautiful, like really genuinely beautiful idea, elegant and weird and smart. It's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, go and read something by Donald Featherstone immediately, because there'll be something in there so old that it's new again, and
Yeah, 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 yeah.
so smart and so sort of inventive. Um, what do you think that old minis games still have to offer?
I mean, it's interesting because it's a I think there has, like, the so old it's new again thing, I think is important, because I think there was a calcification of mechanics 20 years ago, where everyone started designing games that looked the same, and now we're breaking out of that, and because we're breaking out of that, we can now go back to some of the older material and mine it for the good things that were, like, at the time they maybe felt like innovations or proto ideas, but now we're like, we want that stuff back because we don't want everything to look the same, and we don't want all of the systems to be identical. um, and I don't know exactly where I'm looking for in terms of that, but like, I know that, when I was thinking about A Billion Suns, I was going back to Silent Death and trying to like figure out kind of where from these early 90s kind of, the epitome of spaceship design in the early 90s, like what can I bring in from that, from the on the combat system or something. um so I don't know, I just think it's what we can learn, generically speaking, is there is an infinity of possibilities, and all of these tropes that we have grown up with from GW are just tropes, and they are not ironclad rules. They are merely conventions that we have accidentally fallen into repeating.
Yeah, I think definitely if you sort of you go back to the period before the dominance of GW, and it's okay, it's like the pre-Raphaelites in art that that the pre-Raphaelites weren't judging Raphael as being a bad thing, but they're just saying, look, from that point onwards, everything was just versions of Raphael. And maybe if we go like before Raphael, there could be some interesting stuff. I'm not inherently knocking GW, but they did pick one particular thing to do for a while, and a lot of people
Yeah, and
spun off
there's
from
nothing
it.
wrong with that. Like that fitted their business and their business model. It's just that because we all grew up with it, like quite often you'll see a miniature designer. I mean, but it happens less now. But like quite often, when I started designing miniatures games seriously again 10 years ago, like every third set of rules that I saw would just have a GW stat line with different letters at the top of it.
Yeah, and so I think we're in a period where people are sort of breaking back out from like the GW way of doing things, but you can totally go back like
Yeah, because I
just
mean,
before.
GW themselves did.
Yeah. But you can totally go back to a period just before GW started doing that, and there's so many just mad, brilliant ideas going on out there. Favorite implementation of a mechanic in a game. Thinking about this one, I think we've sort of talked about a few mechanics and some few favorite games, and I was thinking about like specifically for me, I love the dice pool and resource mechanic in 7TV, which is very ironic because I hate the character profiles and scenarios in 7TV. I didn't like, it's like the central mechanic of the dice pool and the way that works with the resources, such like absolutely beautiful, elegant, genius little thing. And then everything else
The
on top of
content
it.
you take issue with. It's the content, not the
Yeah, and the
ending.
content just breaks my absolutely just crushes me every time I try to play that game. And it's like I should sit down and write a whole set of units and a whole set of scenarios, but it's like it just makes me so sad every time I read the scenarios for it. But that dice pool mechanic and the resources in it, it's a thing of beauty. It's your favorite implementation of a mechanic in a game, Mike?
Bumping in Robot Rally with the
Yes.
little priority number. It's just so easy, so good, results in so much joy. I have had so much fun because of bumping in Robot Rally in my life.
And last of all, favorite game purely for the mechanics. Um, and I think I could answer a lot of like board games for that, but I feel like that'd almost be cheating in a way. And so I was trying to think of like miniatures games for that. It's really difficult because I think miniatures games are in more ways sort of more inherently tied into
More bits and bobs.
well how they translate the cinema, because it's like a lot of the mechanics get sort of respun and reused for minis games, and it's like how you manage to spin them to a particular story and a particular sort of
Mm-hmm.
recreation of events. And it yeah, and I genuinely don't know that I can come up with a single minis game where I just love owning the mechanics. I mean, you know, a bit sort of self-referential, but genuinely it remains like Gaslands, and but then it's like if we didn't love the mechanics in those games, we would have probably decided to put
Repeat
it.
the question. What's the specific wording of it?
What's your favorite game for purely the mechanics? The game that you
Okay.
play only for the mechanics of the game, not for anything else,
Oh, I
if there
see.
is such a thing. And I genuinely, I don't like I say, board games, tons of them. Minis games, I struggle to think of a minis game that I played just for the mechanics of it
Yeah,
alone.
like I will often request to play Scotland Yard purely because of the mechanics. Like
Hmm.
that could be circles on a blank piece of paper and it would still be as fun. It just doesn't uh
Yeah, no, yeah, tons of like Carcassonne, Kingdom
yeah.
Builder, like half of the SDJ games, you could paint anything on them and tell any story, and it wouldn't
Well,
matter
so I
a damn.
suppose like the one way that I suppose I can translate this in my brain is to say, because my instant reaction in answer to that question was, well, it's Malifaux. I love the mechanical system so much I would play it with with blank circles. But actually, I suppose more to the point, like um Malifaux, and there's a couple of other systems like this where I've taken them and I've just re-skinned them for whatever miniatures I want to. And I think that is also, that for me is kind of the indicator. It's like, well, if I love this system so much that it's sort of, I'm happy to rip it away from its original um, kind of implementation and find like the same sort of mechanical feeling but can be skinned in a different way. I think that that sort of proves to me how much I like the mechanics of that game purely. um or they can, you know, I think the mechanics express a certain kind of cinema so well that I can reimagine that cinema. I can cast it in a different era, like retelling a, you know, like setting a Shakespeare play in a in a modern era or something. It's like all of the beats still work narratively. It's just that, you know, now I've put it in, you know, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe rather than the Malifaux universe.
I know it's weird because it's like I love like the card. Obviously, the card driven mechanics of Malifaux are incredibly elegant and smart, but so much of the rest of that game I find to be so emergent from so many tiny little,
Mm.
you know, bits that I don't find the rest of it mechanically delightful. You know, I just it's like it, you know, it works, but it works from so many sort of little things, none of which I find like inherently impressive, more than like somebody has just forged the shit out of that, you know, absolutely, you know, got it humming, rather than like just amazingly elegant mechanics that work. They've just gone, these mechanics will do, and now I am going to absolutely polish the shit out of them, you know, so they absolutely sing. But I, you know, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I suppose to a degree, I think it would almost be like if that game did exist for us, then almost it would have failed on some fundamental level. Insofar as miniature games, particularly for me, are a cocktail of multiple elements coming together. And if all I can do is enjoy it mechanically, then it's failed to connect two pieces of the puzzle that absolutely need to be wired tightly together.
Yeah,
Perhaps I'm misinterpreting the question, or
no, I
deliberately
think
pushing
it's
it in one direction. But like I think there's a reason for me. There seems a reason why we don't really get abstract miniature games, because it's sort of an oxymoron. Like you could have an abstract, non-discrete game, but as soon as you introduce miniatures into it, like you have broken that. You're now entering a world of tiny cinema, and
and that's the thing. I do think is it's sort of about, it's also about like the conceits that make up the game, where it's like, okay, this thing is exploding. Okay, well, when the explosion happens, what happens to the miniatures around it? Does it feel like an explosion went off?
mm,
And if the game is mechanically good, it is mechanically good because the explosion feels like an explosion, which is a non-mechanical thing. That the
yeah, yeah,
explosion is not a mechanic of the game. The mechanics have to make the explosion feel like an explosion for them to be good mechanics. Whereas like the mechanics in Carcassonne don't have to feel like me building a city or creating a monastery for them to be good mechanics, because in no way do they feel like me building a road. That's that's not relevant. But the things in a miniatures game have to feel like the things they claim they're representing to be good mechanics. And so the idea of a miniatures game that is mechanically good but not any other kind of good is kind of like, mm-hmm. I
yeah.
don't.
That's my feeling. Although thinking about this slightly laterally, it sort of, it makes me think of how much I like Catacombs, which is the little flicking game. It's like a Dungeons and Dragons game, but you flick little wooden um discs around, and when they bump into each other, that does wounds. And I have the first edition of that game, which just has god awful art that's just obnoxious to look at. Um, and you know, fine. I like a dungeon crawl. You know, I'm a Hero Quest kid. I like dungeon crawls as much as anyone. But I'm not, you know, I'm not specifically playing that game because, oh, it's a dungeon crawl game, and I'm certainly not playing it for the frickin' artwork. And there's basically nothing else. That's basically it. There's just the mechanics left at that point. And that's a very non-discrete game where you're, you know, you're making shooting attacks, and okay, it's dexterity rather than dice, but in many respects, that's like a miniatures game that has foregone the miniatures because the mechanics didn't ask for miniatures. You could put little Sabutio guys on top, and I'm sure it would sort of be fine. They'd probably get broken a fair bit, but print them in tough resin and stick them on top of those little discs.
Yeah, I mean, I have specific opinions about the relationship between, non-discrete miniatures games and dexterity games, as in the sort of non-discrete nature of the interest, of
But you
what
shall have to
dexterity
buy
games.
our textbook in November in order to learn more on this topic.
Yes, I have. I have written a chapter in a fine academic textbook on the subject. Okay, and with that, that is the questions that were posed by our wonderful Discord, and it's been a
Guys,
wonderful series of conversations about them. It's been 3 conversations about them that will have come out over the last few weeks. If you've watched all of those conversations, what question didn't get asked that you wish had? Which of the questions that were asked would you most like us to see us do a full conversation about? Because there's a few of them we're definitely going to come back to, that we alluded to. But if there's something that really caught your eye and you're like, I'd like to see these guys talk for another half an hour on this, please let us know, because we'd be more than happy to do so. While you're doing those comments, while you're typing those comments, while you're making those comments, please hit the like and subscribe buttons that are down there. We've just gone past 2,000 subscribers. We'd love to make it to 3. And then follow the links across to the Discord, which is where these conversations did get asked and where very brilliant people were asking them. Follow across to our Patreons and sign up to encourage us to make more of these videos. And swing by our websites and buy our various products and games and good things, because they will make you happy, and you having bought them will make us happy. But for now, and from this series of conversations from Rule of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
cheerio, bye bye.